Welcome everyone. My name is Bill Myers and you're watching the inaugural episode of my show, Sword and Pen. I'm both a trial lawyer and an author in the Philadelphia area, so my show is going to explore both the world of litigation and the world of literature in Philadelphia. Today I'm honored to be joined by Thom Nickels, who's a well-known figure in the literary community in Philadelphia. Thom is the author of 13 books. He's contributed to Philadelphia Magazine, the Philadelphia Inquirer. He's the winner of the AIA Lewis Mumford Architecture Journalism Award. So he's pretty busy. Thom, why don't you tell us a little bit about your history in Philadelphia and how you got your start in the literary community?
Well, it's a long and winding road, Bill. It started in Chester County in Fraser. I was a daily local news delivery boy, so I think that was my first hands-on experience with journalism. And then from there, I always knew that I wanted to be a writer. I started writing for the Wayne Suburban and Times, and then I was an editor of the school magazine at Charles Morris Price. So that was really my beginning. I've lived in Boston and Colorado and Baltimore, came back to Philadelphia from Boston, and at that point I started to write for alternative underground newspapers. I don't know whether if you remember a paper called The Distant Drummer, but I did articles for that paper for a while.
That sounds interesting. Alternative underground newspapers. Tell us a little bit about the history and the role that they played in the Philadelphia literary community.
They were really the sensible alternative to anybody who was thinking outside the box. In those days, and I'm talking late 70s, mid 70s, late 70s, there were the big corporate dailies. And I don't think we need to name them. But outside of that, those publications did not really write about the stuff that you would find in the alternative weeklies. Some subjects were really, really taboo. As a gay activist then, I no longer consider myself a gay activist. But in those days, you couldn't read stuff in the Inquirer or the Daily News. And if you did, it was all very negative, you know. So I remember I had a column in The Drummer. It was called Omar Bloom at White Plains Hospital. And it was about a mythical OR orderly who had all these adventures with surgeons and scrub nurses and kind of reported on the side of hospital life that doesn't get talked about too much. Okay.
So you were using a fictional vehicle to talk about real world things that were actually happening?
I was, yes.
Okay, it's like historical fiction.
Right.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about, and we'll jump here because this show is going to focus on literary Philadelphia, meaning authors mostly who write and are from the Philadelphia area. You, by coincidence, wrote a book, and this is Thom's book, Literary Philadelphia, in which Thom discusses and provides a lot of the background for our very rich and colorful history of literary figures. Thom, why don't you tell me, what is it that motivated you to write the book, and how did you decide where to start?
Well, that's a good question. I initially wanted to do a book on Agnes Repplier, who was an essayist who lived on Clinton Street and in West Philadelphia. She was called a shy Catholic version of Ralph Waldo Emerson. She had whiskey with Walt Whitman. She was somewhat of a devout Catholic, but she was also very secular. Her work appealed to people like Henry James, Edith Wharton, and Dorothy Parker. I consider the whole Dorothy Parker thing really amazing, because if you've ever read Dorothy Parker's work, I mean, she was a supreme city sophisticate. So Agnes Repplier managed to walk that very sensitive tightrope between this, in those days, which was pre-Vatican II Catholicism, which was very strict and looked at with a lot of skepticism from intellectual types. So Agnes did it. She managed it. And I've always felt that her reputation here was so underrated. And she felt underrated when
What were the types of books that she wrote? What were they about? What were the protagonists struggling with?
Well, she wrote mainly nonfiction, and her nonfiction, some of it seems out of date when you reread it. But she wrote about travel, she wrote about cats, about life in the city versus life in the country. She really touched on a diverse array of topics. She wasn't all that good at fiction until she wrote about Catholic saints, the saints who settled Quebec City, Father Junipero Serra, etc. So, and but her portrait of these saints was not the kind of sanitized holy car rhetoric that you would expect from a stereotypical Catholic writer. She liked to sort of present all of the stains and all of the imperfect human stuff.
Yeah, well, saints are people after all, and they are people who face real human problems. They have real human flaws, and what makes them special is that they can draw something from within themselves, flawed though they are, to work good in the world.
Yeah, I think you understand that very well, and she did also. But, you know, the official Catholic, you know, there are always people who don't want to hear the truth. There are always people who get extremely nervous about stuff like that.
Sure, but if you think about it, do you really want to read about a person who's perfect if you're not perfect? One of the things I think that makes contemporary literature so rich is a lot of the protagonists have dark sides. They have flaws, like most people. And so most people, when they're reading about these protagonists, they say, well, that's not some superhero, that's not some superhuman, that's a person like me who has flaws, weaknesses, but battles the bad guys or battles, you know, big institutional problems and prevails.
That's true. I think about, when we talk about people not wanting to know the truth, I think about James Michener, who was also in my book. I compare James Michener to Christopher Morley. Morley tended to write about the Biddles and old Philadelphia families. So it was a very kind of a safe, cushiony kind of a repertoire. Michener, on the other hand, was the polar opposite. And at one point, Michener wrote an article for Holiday magazine, and he talked about West Manayunk and the people of West Manayunk being these like dark and shrouded figures, like, you know, hugging the old cliffs of Pittsburgh or something. And the town was so upset that they voted to change the name from West Manayunk to Belmont Hills. Of course, these days, that wouldn't mean a thing. What a writer said in any magazine, it certainly wouldn't.
Right.
It wouldn't lead to that.
Well, that's interesting. Now, I know that in the book, you talk about the competition between Walt Whitman and Bayard Taylor.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that. That seems like to be a pretty rich competition.
Bayard Taylor was a poet. He was a novelist. He wrote a novel called Joseph and His Friend. He was a society darling. He knew all the right people. His writing offended no one. Walt Whitman, on the other hand, was controversial. His writing offended a lot of people. They were each offered a chance to contribute a hymn to that centennial, and Taylor won, and Whitman lost. Taylor didn't think much of Walt Whitman's work.
What was it about Walt Whitman that was controversial?
Well, it was his earthy, sensual references that were unsettling to many people. Taylor said that Whitman's work wasn't fit to be read under the evening lamplight. Whitman himself was was also known as a kind of a freeloader. I mean, he was no saint. You know, we talk about human imperfections. He was known as somebody who wanted to be supported as a major charity case. But in his case, people tended to sort of do that.
Back then, was there, if you were a writer and you were fairly well known, successful, was there patronage in the sense that you think of Venetian patronage of famous painters and sculptors?
There were, I know that in Whitman's case, it was more unofficial, and it was more on a casual friendship basis as far as I know. Whitman just had so many fans despite his detractors that he was able to sort of have this kind of fan club all around him constantly. He was, though, when he was a school teacher in Long Island, he was almost tarred and feathered because of a very controversial accusation from a Presbyterian minister who gave a sermon one Sunday that he had molested the son of a certain family. And in those days, teachers actually slept with their students. It was common practice.
Crazy.
A teacher would often live with the family, and people thought nothing of betting the teacher with the pupil. I think this was only true in the case of two males, because it just never entered their mind that anything could happen. Anyway, a crowd came to Whitman's residence. They put tar on his face, almost railroaded him out of town, but he was saved by his sister Mary and another woman who basically lectured the crowd to sort of get lost. That would not happen today.
No. And Whitman, of course, went on and had a very successful literary career. Today, I can't even imagine somebody surmounting something like that. I mean, you would just be, your name would be mud.
It would be a death knell forever. It would be a premature burial with no hope of resurrection, as we both know. Yeah.
Right. Tell me some more about local authors who are maybe as polarizing, or maybe not as polarizing, but still people who were not just worshipped, but you know, they had detractors and fans at the same time.
Well, anytime you put your name on a column or a feature, you are subject to the slings and arrows of both, you know, positive and negative stuff. I like to read biographies of writers because it's almost a primer on sort of how to deal with this stuff. I know that for myself, there's a hypersensitive core that has always affected. I don't care how long you've been writing, 20, 30 years, it still hits that molten center initially. But what you learn to do is to kind of carve it over with cement and put it over here. But it's still, there's still that plug. I used to write for the LGBT media. I had a column in a magazine called the Lambda Book Report. It was a spirituality column. I once wrote a book about transgender issues. Now, I have a very, very open mind. I don't think I'm a mean person. I don't think I discriminate. But because I used the wrong pronouns, I got hate mail this long. And it was unbelievable to me. And it was at that point that I thought, I think I need to step away from the official LGBT community because I don't recognize it anymore.
You bring up an issue that if a writer's going to write honestly, okay, write what he truly believes, truly feels, he's going to offend some people, and other people are going to approve of what he says. It's the exact opposite of politics. In politics, you know, you try to modulate your language in a way that anyone can read into it what they believe, what they accept, and you're offending the least number of people. But for writers, you know, what you're doing is you're taking stuff from inside and you're putting it out there in the world, and it's risky. if you're writing honestly, if you're not just writing to please the most people and offend the least people, you're taking a risk, especially nowadays when the media has instant access to everything, and something you say at 10 o'clock in the morning could be all over the news by 10:05.
Exactly true. This is the age when things are taken out of context, and it's also a time when some people, like politicians, of course, you will rarely get truth from a politician, I believe. But if you're a true writer, you just have to call them as you see them. And you're always going to have enemies. You're always going to have people who don't like your stuff. What I don't like when that happens is when people go on Amazon and give you a bad book review because they have a grudge, some kind of an editorial disagreement, and then they do other things to sort of, change that into a more permanent sword mark.
Yeah, and in that way, you are, as an author, you're instantly accountable for what you write. I know in my first book, A Criminal Defense, there were some people who took exception to some of the language that some of the characters used, because these were very coarse characters, they used coarse language. And so to be true to the character and have the character talk the way that character would talk, they would use, curse words. And some people registered not only disapproval, but outrage that some of these words would be in the book when, 99.9% of the book has nothing to do with that, and that has nothing to do with the message in the book. So what do you do? I mean, if you're an author and let's say you're writing fiction and you want people to read the fiction and you believe you're writing good stories, interesting stories, what do you do? I mean, do you just say, you know what, I don't care, I'm going to write this character true to the character, or do you modulate it a little bit?
Well, I think let's take the infamous F word, which now you hear everywhere. It's almost too much. I make it a point not to use it because it's so common. I like to use other words in place of it. But if I'm writing about a character, and if the character uses it, of course you have to use it if you want an honest portrayal. You can't worry about the public's reaction to a creative work while you're writing it. That would be a lethal killer. It would just kill creativity. You can't worry about what anybody would think. As you know, you just let that raw, unfiltered stuff come out onto the page. Then when you're in your editing mode, that's when you do the school teacher thing.
Yeah. Do you find, like when you're writing fiction, do you find that you'll start out with a vision of a certain character, and maybe they're just going to be a plot device you start off with, and you start writing the character, and then the character says things, does things that you didn't know the character was going to do, and the story kind of turns this way or this way?
That's a great question. I've been toying with that all of my writing life so far. There are novelists who make these elaborate graphs. This character will meet this character. They have the whole life destiny plan all set out. I've often wondered about that approach. When I sit down to write a novel, the characters do take off. They go in their own direction. They almost have control of you. It's almost like a strange mediumship or something. And so when I approach fiction, it's almost sacramental, but it's a truly transcendental head trip. So yes, to your question, the characters can take over.
Yeah, I've found the same thing that you've found, where I'll be sitting there writing, and I don't feel like this is Bill Myers making this character say something. This is this character coming down through my head into my arm and saying it.
Exactly, and one of the writers that I write about here is John McIntyre, who is an Irish Catholic novelist. I don't know why I keep mentioning Irish Catholic, but he grew up in Northern Liberties.
Right.
He left school at 11. He worked at 11 years old. His novels are about the rustic untoward, seamy side under the Frankfurt L. So he writes about streetwalkers and the dingy bars under the L, and his characters pull no punches. You know, they'll go from a conversation in a bar talking about the Virgin Mary right to a brothel in some section of the city, and there's no disconnect, but it's actually as life is truly lived.
Yeah, I know he wrote Steps Going Down. That was his
Down.
his breakthrough novel, and that kind of gritty, living on the street type of experience. So different from the antiseptic experience of people who work in the high rises and live their lives in carpeted hallways. But that life still exists in Philadelphia, in large parts of Philadelphia, where people don't, they're not in the giant skyscrapers. They're living like normal working class men and women, and people who are on the underside of the law, scraping by, doing things they're not supposed to be doing, putting themselves in harm's way. And it's kind of a rich tapestry. We still have that.
Sure. It's also fun, though, to sort of read about the rich and famous, because you can also be a truth teller that way. You can be just as gritty in terms of telling the truth with a higher echelon of people, because they have the same drama. It may not take place in a saloon under the L. It'll take place in a penthouse, but the drama is just as good.
What would you say is your favorite book in that genre?
Oh, I knew you were going to ask me that question.
I know. Never ask someone what's their favorite book.
I think of Tom Wolfe, not Thomas Wolfe. And I think of, he was a cousin of Gore Vidal's. It's a Greek name, a long Greek name that ends with two S's. I can't pronounce it.
Okay.
But there are several, yeah.
Okay. How about contemporary writers who write more of the gritty writing? What would you say are your favorites?
I've lost my taste for a lot of the grit. I used to read William Burroughs until I decided that a large part of this is nonsense. The whole cut up and paste method, where he would paste random paragraphs together and then call it art. Well, I mean, that sounds very avant-garde. You could do it in the Museum of Modern Art and it might get a nice round of applause, but it doesn't hold over time. One of my favorite writers was Susan Sontag, who died, I don't know, about 9-10 years ago. But I used to like Paul Goodman too. He wrote a novel called The Empire City, and Growing Up Absurd, which was a classic in the late 50s and 60s. And also a diary called 5 Years, which is pretty scandalous.
Okay. When you read, and I'll ask you the same question when you write, when you read, do you find yourself attracted to certain themes?
That can change over time. I used to like scandalous sexual things, to be truthful. That's why I read all the journals of André Gide, and Paul Goodman and Cocteau, and the New York diaries of Ned Rorem, famous composer, goes to bed in Paris, goes to the opera drunk, winds up in bed with XYZ, etc. That gets boring after a time. Now I look for something far more substantial, something with real spiritual insight, so that whole earthly, passionate, fleshy thing doesn't really move me.
Do you think that your own writing has deepened you as a person? I mean, do you pay more attention to things going on out there in the world and your relationships with other people? Has it caused you to explore things that you don't think you otherwise would have explored on just a 9-to-5 job? Absolutely.
I've done a lot of columns on the homeless. I do have a couple of weekly columns, but then, I mean, I find that I have different audiences. So I have this kind of street audience, but I have an educated audience that you might meet at a press event around cocktails. So I've found that fascinating, how I can have this multi-tiered readership. And but
Have you formed any conclusions? And now we're jumping from literature to kind of like real life. You've written columns on the homeless. Have you formed any conclusions as to, in Philadelphia, what would be the best way to help them or handle the problem?
Well, unfortunately, most of them are on drugs, i.e. heroin, and a lot of them want to be homeless. A lot of them think it's a great urban adventure. Most of them, from my experience, don't like the shelters. There are too many restrictions, too many rules, and there's also kind of this like drama within the shelters that is not very pretty sometimes.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, sometimes I think that the shelter officials play favorites, and maybe there's a racial bias one way or another. I've heard both sides of the stories. Maybe they just don't like someone. Stuff is getting stolen. All of their belongings are getting stolen. I don't know how many homeless people I talk to, they've lost their IDs again. They're always reapplying for their IDs. You know, it's this kind of thing.
Right. So for us, what's the best way that just the average citizen can help the homeless? Can they help the homeless?
I think probably just by buying them food. Rather than giving them money, because they have great stories about how they need transportation money, but it all goes into the Kensington Badlands.
Okay.
For the most part.
What are you working on right now?
I am working on a book about the adopted son of Mother and Father Divine, and so this would be quite a different book.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, Mother and Father Divine adopted a son from California. He was spotted by one of their people in LA in a kind of a yoga retreat center. And the boy came from a poor family with an abusive father, a very, very poor mother. The woman liked him, sent his picture into Father Divine. Father Divine liked his look. He needed an heir, because they don't have sex at the Peace Mission. So even though you're married, you're like the Shakers, there's no sexual commingling. So he needed a son. They took Tommy and his sister out to Philadelphia in a benign kidnapping caravan-like thing, paid off the mother. I mean, you know, I don't know what deal they struck with the mother, but she went back to California, and Tommy was raised in the mansion with Mother and Father Divine, and his sister was raised in the city. So, but Tommy has a story to tell.
That's a story I want to hear about. And when you finish writing that book, I'd love to read it. I'd love to interview you about it. I'd love to talk to you about it. We've been talking today with Thom Nickels, who's a very well-known figure in the Philadelphia literary community and the Philadelphia community in general. And I'm really proud, Thom, that you joined me for the inaugural episode of this show.
Thank you,
Thank
Bill.
you for being here.
It's great to be a part of this.
Thank you.
Sure.
And again, this is one of Thom's many books, Literary Philadelphia, discussing some of our more colorful literary figures. I would encourage everyone to pick up a copy. Thom, where can they get a copy of Literary Philadelphia?
Oh, it's all over Barnes & Noble and Amazon and the really good bookstores around town. Philadelphia Museum of Art also.
Okay. Thank you again, Thom.
Thanks you, Bill.
Thank you, everyone.